Most people are used to fighting axes being shaped like this, but what does it mean when they're shaped like this? Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, most of you will be familiar with the generic shape of an axe. If someone asks you to draw a battle axe, you'll probably draw something that looks a bit like this, or maybe something that looks a bit like this. They're not that different, and they do nevertheless, fighting axes come in a variety of different shapes, and some of them have a straighter edge, some of them have a more curved edge. And in fact, we looked at this topic recently in specific application to the so-called poleaxe. Now, the poleaxe is a very specialised weapon of this type is of the 15th century. They go into the 16th century as well. They start out in the 14th century, but this type is a late 15th century design, and you'll notice it has a straight axe blade. And we were asking, why does this have a straight edge? Now, funnily enough, when then looking at much, much earlier axes, so we're going sort of 400 years, 500 years earlier to these great axes from the Viking era and the Norman era, some of these have curved edges and some of them have almost straight edges. Moreover, as I explained in my previous video, they're also sometimes tilted, and that's true of the poleaxes as well. So sometimes we have a curved edge that is at 90 degrees to the shaft here, and sometimes, like this one here, it's slightly tilted forward. Some of them are very tilted forward. So we end up with very different edge angles relative to things we're striking at. And I put forward the theory that this is relative to the length of the shaft and the way that they're being swung and the impact point you want on the target. And if you're standing on foot and you've got a shaft that is this kind of length or similar to it, then when you're hitting someone, it means that you're still actually hitting about 90 degrees perpendicular to the thing that you're hitting, because it's relative to the length of the shaft. That being said, clearly not everybody thought the angle on the blade was the best thing in the world, because as we see, some of them are 90 degrees and some of them are tilted forward at closer to, not quite 45, but in that direction. So whether we've got a straight edge or a curved edge, some are in line with the shaft and some are tilted forwards. We see almost no axes that are tilted backwards, with the exception of a type of axe. Can you guess it? Do you know what I'm talking about? We might look at that in a future video. In fact, I've been asked to a number of times, but generally speaking, blades are either in line with the shaft or tilted forwards of the shaft, either straight or either curved. Now, we did then ask, why do some axes have curved edges? In fact, most of them have curved edges, and why are some straighter? I put forward the theory this might be to do with what you're actually hitting. Now, clearly in the age of the poleaxe, this is a specialised armoured fighting weapon. This is for smashing into people who are wearing mixed levels of armour. Now, some people correctly pointed out that you're not always going to be hitting armoured people, and in fact, very often you'll want to use the hammer side or spike beak side if you've got one of those instead, against armoured opponents for hooking or trying to pierce into mail in gaps behind the legs and stuff like this, or into visors or possibly other stuff like that. So why would you use the axe blade? And maybe the axe blade is for fighting against the more lightly equipped people. And I have put forward this theory in the past myself. So in other words, it's giving you various options for fighting different levels of armoured opponents. The only slight problem with that is within a 15th century context when these were around. First of all, this is the weapon that pretty much knights or men-at-arms chose to use against other knights or men-at-arms. This is specialised for fighting in the barriers and duels and stuff like this, and very popular for that. Well, in that situation, there isn't anybody else without armour to strike, because you're just fighting against another armoured person. So that would undermine that theory. Moreover, the other thing which undermines it is, having looked at a number of originals, for example, Wallace Collection, Royal Armouries, the ROM in Toronto, various other museums of these that I've looked at, they're not usually very edged. And I think that would come to a surprise to a lot of people, even people making replicas or living history people. If you actually go into museums and look at the originals of these, very often the edge geometry of these is not very good for cutting, and moreover, some of them don't even seem to have been really sharpened. So you've got a kind of blade here that will nevertheless do some damage and do some harm to either armour or flesh or whatever you hit, but it doesn't seem to be primarily for cutting per se. That's the second thing. And the third and final reason why I don't think that's the reason for these axe blades is because within a 15th century context, the majority of people on the 15th century battlefield have got some level of armour. Now, I know there might be some exceptions to that, like the Battle of Towton, where we think vast numbers of levies were raised, and they might not have had basic armour like helmets or even padded jacks or whatever. They might just have been in civilian clothing and holding a bow or a spear as fit. But on a lot of battlefields in the 15th century, people had a basic minimum of armour, which usually was a helmet of some type, usually a sallet, usually something on their torso, a mail shirt, a gambeson, a padded jack, a brigandine, something like this, and very often additional bits of armour on their hands, arms, legs, whatever they could get. So even the kind of lightly equipped soldiers like Swiss pikemen or English longbowmen, they still had quite a bit of armour on them. So anyway, just to say that within the context, this is very much, I think, for armoured fighting. So therefore, straight edge, curved edge, possibly it's for hitting armour as opposed to hitting flesh. Curved edge is better for going flesh. That being said, as I mentioned in the previous video, we do find that things like the Dane axe sometimes has straight edges, sometimes has curved edges. And that's in a period where a lot of people don't really have very much armour, that maybe a helmet if they're lucky, and the really good ones would have a mail shirt. So if we look at the Bayeux Tapestry, for example, the housecarls pretty much universally have got mail shirts, the Norman cavalry have got mail shirts. Not all of the Anglo-Saxon infantry have armour, but mail shirts, that is. But anyway, that's a different thing. Curved, straight, might be something to do with armour, might not. It could have been personal preference. If we look at modern world comparisons for a second, I didn't really go into this that much in my previous video, we can find contradictory evidence. Actually, if you look at a meat cleaver, most meat cleavers for chopping meat and bone have a straight edge. Some wood chopping axes have curved edge, some have a straight edge. Fire axes, sometimes curved edge, sometimes straight edge. So, you know, feel free to carry on with the kind of theorising in the comments below this. But what I'm really here to talk about is the forwards curved crescent axe. Now, this is an example actually from my antique business, and it gives me a great example, by pure luck, gives me a great example to talk about. Now, a lot of you noted that very often axe blades are backwards curved, very often they're straight, and some people said, but Matt, what about the forwards curved or crescent shaped axe blade? Now, first of all, we should say these are extremely rare compared to the other blades I've just shown. Okay, so compared to straight edges, curved edges, of those normal kind of axe shapes, they vastly predominate right the way across history, whether it's back into ancient Egypt where they used axes, or whether it's always all the way forwards into modern time with wood chopping axes, or you know, all the types of fighting axes, from tomahawks to pole axes to various types of battle axe from, you know, India, North Africa, Europe, North America, it doesn't really matter where you go. The majority of axes are those conventional sort of variety of shapes, and these are the outliers. So the question is, what do these crescent blades, what do they signify perhaps? What's their purpose? Now, I know that on YouTube channels like mine, a lot of people want a physical purpose. Now, what I would say is it's not always about that. And you have to bear in mind that some of these crescent axes, this is Indo-Persian, might come from places where a crescent shape, for example in Islam, has specific symbolic importance. So the fact that, you know, you can still hit someone and hurt someone quite badly with one of these is good enough if you can use a symbolic shape that is relevant to your religion, your you know, culture, whatever. If that's relevant and you can still use it as a weapon, that might be enough of a reason to have it. So the crescent axe on an Indo-Persian axe like this might have purely symbolic meaning. However, there is another type of crescent axe which I don't think has any symbolic meaning at all that we find in Renaissance and, well, even post-Renaissance Europe, and that is on halberds. Now, interestingly, these halberds that you find these crescent blades on have very long tips, very long spikes. They've usually got a back hook, back spike, and then they have these crescent blades. And the question is, why? Why did they develop these crescent blades on what seems to be for purely practical or utilitarian purposes, not symbolic? probably, but not 100% certain on that. Why did they develop these forwards curved blades? Now, there's a few theories we could come up with. One of those might be that it could be about trying to trap or isolate, shall we say, and cut certain body parts. Now, interestingly, there are some theories about the origin of the word for halberd. It's possible that halberds are, because one word is helm butt, which basically means helmet axe. An axe for chopping into people's helmets, possibly. That's one theory. Now, if you're chopping down at people from above, pretty much universally, because you're in massed ranks and you're using halberds, it could be that these are for basically chopping people's necks off, chopping people's heads off, and having a forwards curve, because you're aiming at one specific body part. Perhaps a crescent blade has a specific purpose. The only thing against that is actually, if we look at headsman's axes across multiple cultures, they're not normally that shape. Usually a headsman's axe is somewhere like this. So I don't really think that's the reason. Is it to do with hooking? Possibly. It could be that this type of crescent blade, if you know, whether it chops or not, and it will chop to some extent, once you've hit a target, it gives you the ability to push or pull and control. So that's possible as well. That being said, a halberd already has a hook on the back, so why do you need one on the front? Wouldn't it be better to have a better chopping blade? And some halberds obviously do. They have a conventional axe blade, and you've got the hook at the back if you want to hook anyway. Perhaps it's something to do with against other polearms. Now, I think this is actually closer to reality. So these types of halberds were often used against pikes or half pikes, so in other words, spears. And if we look at certain polearm designs, for example, the partisan or the corset, the ranseur, things like this, they often have extensions or shapes to them, even the winged spear, that are designed to oppose other polearms. So they are specifically for fighting against other polearms. Now, if you've got a blade that's this shape, predominantly you're going in against pikemen, it could be that as well as having a controlling point here and a controlling point here and the hook at the back, having an axe blade that is this shape and enables you to lock on and twist or push down an opposing pike is useful. Can you think of other reasons? I'm sure there are other ones, but really just to sum up and finalise there, that we do find crescent-shaped axe blades. You find them in Indo-Persia, you find them in India, you find them in medieval and Renaissance and post-Renaissance Europe. You know, you find them in Africa occasionally. You basically do sometimes find crescent-shaped axe blades. However, firstly, they are very rare. They only turn up in specific weapons like the sort of 17th century halberd, for example, and these Indo-Persian axes occasionally. Oh, and the one other point as well I forgot to mention, actually, one weird advantage of these is you end up with these points. So actually, aside from having this sickle-like blade in here, which can trap and chop, you do get penetration from these points. So it's a bit like having a beak or a spike on the back. Even if you hit with the top, you might, for example, in someone's head, you might penetrate a bit like with a pick or a war hammer. So that's another thing to mention. But anyway, they're rare things. They do turn up, however, and they are worth mentioning. Crescent-shaped axe blades. Maybe you didn't know about them, did you or didn't you? But specifically in regards to European halberds, what do you think their purpose was? I don't think it can be symbolic. I think in Islamic countries it can be because it relates to symbols which are popular there. But can you think of any other practical or utilitarian purposes for having these? I'm not sure that I can, but maybe there is a treatise out there or some source which describes the purpose of crescent axe blades that I don't know about yet. So educate me if there is, and I'm looking forward to seeing your theories in the comments down below. Thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will continue to be, whether I'm holding an axe or a sword or whatever else next time, and I hope to see you back here really soon. Cheers, folks!